Russia is burning at Kupiansk, not metaphorically, literally. Literally. At dawn on the western bank of the Oskil River, what was supposed to be Vladimir Putin's signature winter trophy, the city he personally claimed on national television, has turned into the largest open-air kill zone of this war. The 6th Combined Arms Army, once paraded by the Kremlin as the elite force that would crack the northern shoulder of Ukraine's defensive line, is no longer maneuvering. It is bleeding into the mud at a confirmed ratio of 27 Russian soldiers killed for every single Ukrainian soldier lost, according to British military intelligence cited by the Times. 27-1. Let that sink in for a moment. That is not attrition. That is not difficult combat. That is an army being processed. This is not a story about a city changing hands. This is not a story about one more contested settlement in Kharkiv Oblast. What you are witnessing at Kupiansk is the operational collapse of the largest Russian grouping committed to a single axis in this war, a grouping the Kremlin built around the explicit assumption that it could break Ukraine before winter ended. And the question I want you to hold in your mind for the next 24 minutes is not whether Kupiansk falls or holds. The question is much harder, much more consequential, and much more revealing. The real question is this: how does an army of more than 100,000 men with armor, artillery, electronic warfare, and a year of preparation end up encircled in pockets of 200, begging for resupply through underground sewage pipes, while their own mill bloggers post obituaries on Telegram? Before this analysis is finished, you will understand not just what happened at Kupiansk. You will understand why it was always going to happen, because Kupiansk is not an incident. Kupiansk is a verdict on the entire Russian theory of this war. Pull the lens back, rewind to the autumn of 2024. At that time, the assumption inside the Russian General Staff, and frankly inside a significant portion of Western commentary, was that Ukraine's northern flank along the Oskil River had become the soft shoulder of the front. Pokrovsk was absorbing the world's attention. Kursk was draining Ukrainian reserves. Russian planners looked at the map and saw an opportunity that, on paper, looked overwhelming. Seize bridgeheads across the Oskil, push west into Kharkiv Oblast, encircle Kupiansk from the north, collapse Ukrainian logistics feeding the entire Donetsk axis, and then, with the city in hand, threaten Lyman and the broader Sloviansk-Kramatorsk fortress belt from a direction Kiev could not easily reinforce. That was the plan. On paper, it was elegant. On paper, it was the kind of operational design taught in staff colleges. And on paper, the Russians had every advantage. They committed somewhere north of 100,000 men to this axis over the course of 2025. They identified Kupiansk as a strategic priority from mid-2025 onward, prioritized by Putin himself. They placed a former Ukrainian officer turned Russian commander Lieutenant General Sergei Storozhenko of the 6th Combined Arms Army at the head of the offensive, and Estilwaki Ekambri and Sextilry and Likanj, a man chosen precisely because he was supposed to know how Ukrainians think. They established 3 separate bridgeheads across the Oskil, at Dvorikna, at Topoly, at Kamyanka. They captured Sobolivka 3 kilometers west of the city. By August, Russian state media was already announcing street battles inside Kupiansk. By late September, the Ukrainian military administration declared the city closed to civilians. And in November, Vladimir Putin personally went on television and declared Kupiansk captured. The first mistake was not tactical. The first mistake was psychological. Russia confused the appearance of advance with the substance of advance. It confused mill blogger triumphalism with battlefield reality. It confused infiltration of small assault groups into the ruins of a destroyed city with operational control over the terrain. And most fatally, it confused Ukrainian patience with Ukrainian weakness. Because while Russian forces were funneling men across the Oskil into what looked like a slow strangulation of Kupiansk, the Ukrainian command under General Alexander Syrskyi was assembling something the Russians did not see coming and did not understand even when it began to operate against them. A search strike group, a drone-saturated kill architecture, and a counter-encirclement plan that would not announce itself until it had already closed. That operation, I want you to remember, began in September 2025. It was not made public until December 12th. 3 full months of preparation, infiltration, and silent shaping of the battlefield. While the Kremlin's propaganda machine was busy planting flags on maps Russia did not actually control. 3 months in which Ukrainian forces studied every Russian crossing, every supply route, every rotation pattern across the Oskil, and turned the river itself, the river that was supposed to be Russia's springboard, into Kharkiv Oblast, Anchi Osfii, Anchi Orki, into the largest contiguous drone kill zone on the Eastern Front. And it gets even more serious from here. By spring of 2025, the front around Kupiansk had stabilized into something that, to Western observers, looked like a Russian success, and to Russian planners looked like the prelude to a breakthrough. 3 bridgeheads on the western bank, a growing perimeter west of Sobolivka, probing attacks toward Malashapkivka and Kindrashivka. The Russian Ministry of Defense claimed settlement after settlement. Russian state television showed maps with arrows pushing west, north, south in every direction at once. And in May, even during the so-called Victory Day ceasefire, Russian forces marginally advanced near Dvorichna. The narrative was clear. The Russians were grinding, but they were grinding forward. What that narrative missed, what mainstream framing still misses, is what was happening in the airspace above the Oskil while those ground arrows crept on the map. The hidden military variable was not territory. It was tempo of resupply. By summer 2025, every Russian unit operating on the western bank of the Oskil was dependent on a single, fragile, exposed chain of crossings: pontoons, suspension footbridges, improvised river fords, and small boats. Ukrainian fiber optic FPV drones, immune to Russian electronic warfare jamming, were already mapping every meter of those crossings. The 429th Separate Drone Regiment Achilles, along with allied Ukrainian drone formations, was building what military analysts now openly call a drone dual zone, a contested airspace so dense, so saturated, that no Russian vehicle and increasingly no Russian individual soldier could move across the Oskil in daylight without entering a probability cone of destruction. And here is the doctrinal point that mainstream coverage refuses to take seriously. In the modern war that Ukraine has forced upon Russia, you do not need to retake terrain in order to neutralize it. You need to deny it logistically. You need to make the cost of holding it exceed the strategic value of holding it. You need to convert the enemy's geography into the enemy's prison. And that is precisely what Ukrainian commanders did to every Russian unit that crossed the Oskil between January and November of 2025. They let them in, they watched them in, they counted them in, and then they sealed the door behind them with drones, artillery, and precision strikes on every crossing the 6th Combined Arms Army depended on. By August, Russian forces were inside Kupiansk in small infiltration groups, fighting block by block in a city already reduced to broken concrete. By September, Putin was being briefed that capture was imminent. By October, Russian mill bloggers were quietly noting that the men who had crossed into Kupiansk were not being relieved on schedule. By November, when Putin made his televised claim that Kupiansk was under Russian control, the truth on the ground was almost the exact opposite. Russian forces did not control Kupiansk. Russian forces were trapped inside it. This matters enormously, because the entire Russian theory of victory at Kupiansk depended on the assumption that the Oskil River would be a usable supply artery once the bridgeheads were established. That assumption was wrong. It was wrong from the day Ukrainian fiber optic drones began saturating the airspace above the river. It was wrong from the day Ukrainian strike groups began targeting pontoon bridges as fast as Russian engineers could build them. It was wrong from the moment Russian commanders decided that volume of men compensated for vulnerability of supply. And the proof of how wrong it was came in early December when Ukrainian special forces, drone units, and assault troops launched what we now know was the second phase of the Kupiansk operation, the closing of the trap. Let me walk you through what this actually means at the strategic level. On December 12, 2025, the Ukrainian command went public. Ukrainian forces had retaken Radkivka, Tishchenkivka, Mern, and a series of associated settlements on the approaches to Kupiansk. They had cut off the Russian forces inside the city from their crossings on the Oskil. The Institute for the Study of War confirmed that Ukrainian forces were maintaining fire control over the Russian crossings, meaning that Russian troops attempting to reinforce the Kupiansk pocket were being destroyed before they reached the western bank. President Volodymyr Zelensky personally visited Kupiansk to mark the operation. And the most telling detail of all, the detail that Russian mill bloggers themselves admitted, within 72 hours, roughly 200 Russian soldiers were left encircled inside Kupiansk with no resupply, no evacuation, and no realistic prospect of breakout. By mid-December, that number had collapsed to roughly 120 and was still falling. 200, 120, out of a grouping of more than 100,000 men committed to this axis over 12 months. That is what the Russian capture of Kupiansk had actually delivered. Not a city, not a foothold, not a springboard into Kharkiv Oblast, a pocket of doomed infantry, surrounded, hungry, and dying, while their command structure in Moscow continued to broadcast that Kupiansk had been taken. And here's the detail that, more than any other, captures the doctrinal humiliation of this campaign. In mid-December, Russian troops attempted to resupply and reinforce their forces inside Kupiansk by sending small infiltration groups through an underground pipeline running beneath the contested ground. Ukraine's 429th Achilles Drone Regiment located the pipe. Ukrainian forces destroyed it. A second attempt was made near the Oskil River south of the city, equally suicidal, equally crushed. Think about what that means. The largest Russian grouping committed to any single axis in this war, Putin's flagship offensive of 2025, was reduced to crawling through sewage pipes to try to reach men who were already encircled. And those crawls did not succeed. Pull the lens back further, because the collapse at Kupiansk is not just a humiliation for Russian arms. It is a verdict on the entire economic and industrial logic of Russia's 2025 campaign. The Kremlin spent the year burning through manpower at a rate that even Russian sources, when they are honest, describe as unsustainable. Casualty figures published by Ukrainian intelligence and corroborated by Western estimates put Russian losses at well over 1 million killed and wounded since February 2022, with the steepest rate of attrition coming in 2025 itself. CSIS estimates that Russia has lost something on the order of 1 to 1.2 million men killed, wounded, captured, or missing. And the Kupiansk axis alone, by the most credible operational accounts, has consumed somewhere in the neighborhood of 100,000 Russian soldiers across 12 months for territorial gains that, by December, were being reversed at fire brigade speed. This is industrial-scale failure dressed up in tactical language. Russia is not running out of men yet. Russia is running out of the political room to keep paying the casualty bill. Recruitment bonuses have climbed to figures that would have been unthinkable in 2022. Regional governors are openly competing to meet quotas. And Russian war bloggers, Kupiansk in the Irashtury, the closest thing the Kremlin has to a feedback mechanism, are now writing publicly that the 6th Combined Arms Army has been ground down at Kupiansk to the point of operational ineffectiveness. The Kremlin's response has been the same response it always gives: deny, reframe, send more men, send more equipment, send more lies to the Russian television audience that has been told for 14 months that Kupiansk was already taken. What happens next changes everything, because the climactic phase of this story is not the encirclement of the men inside Kupiansk. The climactic phase is what Ukrainian forces did with the operational opening that the Russian collapse created. In the third week of December 2025, while Russian forces inside the pocket were dying and Russian command outside the pocket was paralyzed, Ukrainian troops did something that should be studied in every Western staff college for the next 20 years. They began rolling up the Russian bridgeheads on the western bank of the Oskil one by one. Holubivka, Petropavlivka, the northern approaches to Kupiansk, the southern flank toward Kindrashivka. Each settlement that the Russians had claimed in their winter and spring advances came back under Ukrainian fire control or outright Ukrainian occupation, while the airspace above the river remained a fiber optic drone gauntlet that no Russian armored column could survive in daylight. This is the moment in military history that future analysts will mark as the operational reversal of Russia's 2025 campaign. Not because Ukraine launched a dramatic counteroffensive on the scale of Kharkiv 2022, but because Ukraine demonstrated in front of the entire world that the Russian theory of grinding attritional victory was not slow, it was terminally inefficient. 27-1. That is the kill ratio at Kupiansk. There is no manpower reserve anywhere in Russia that can sustain 27 to 1. There is no economic model anywhere in the world that can pay the recruitment premiums required to sustain 27 to 1. There's no political system that can survive 27 to 1 indefinitely, even one as opaque and repressive as the one Vladimir Putin has built. And the broader lesson here is one that goes far beyond Kupiansk, far beyond Kharkiv Oblast, and far beyond Ukraine itself. What you are watching in real time is the demonstration of a new doctrine of defense, one in which a smaller force with a denser drone architecture, faster decision cycles, and disciplined patience can convert an enemy's offensive concentration into the enemy's own destruction. Russia did not lose Kupiansk because the Russians were stupid. Russia lost Kupiansk because Russia was fighting a 2014 war against a 2025 opponent. The Russian command kept assuming that mass, time, and pressure would produce the breakthrough. The Ukrainian command understood that in the modern drone-saturated battle space, mass without survival logistics is not strength. It is a target, and it gets even more serious from here. Because every Western defense ministry watching this, every NATO planner, every staff officer in Berlin, in Warsaw, in Paris, in London, in Washington, is now rewriting their own doctrinal assumptions in real time. The lesson of Kupiansk is not Ukraine is winning, and in this free chain in free. The lesson of Kupiansk is that the era of armored offensive maneuver as the decisive instrument of modern war is, if not over, then under the most serious threat it has faced since the introduction of the machine gun in 1914. A river crossing defended by drones can swallow an army. A city contested by drones can become a tomb for the side that holds the larger force. A supply line exposed to drones can collapse a corps before that corps ever fights its decisive battle. This is the moment future historians will mark, not because Kupiansk itself is decisive in the way Stalingrad was decisive, but because Kupiansk is the clearest, cleanest, most undeniable demonstration that Russia's theory of victory in this war has failed at the operational level. The Kremlin spent 12 months and 100,000 men proving, in front of the entire world, that it cannot take a city it personally identified as a strategic priority against a Ukrainian force that was outnumbered roughly 5 to 1 at the point of contact. If Russia cannot win at Kupiansk with everything it threw at Kupiansk, then the entire premise that time is on Moscow's side in this war is, and I choose this word carefully, if we were so refuted. History will record the Kupiansk operation as the campaign in which the 6th Combined Arms Army, one of the most storied formations in the Russian ground forces, was reduced from a strategic asset to a cautionary tale. History will record that the largest single grouping Vladimir Putin committed to any axis of the 2025 campaign did not capture its objective, did not even hold its bridgeheads, and ended the year with its forward elements reduced to crawling through pipes in pursuit of men already condemned. And history will record that the Ukrainian command under General Syrsky demonstrated that a smaller, smarter, more technologically adaptive military can not only resist a much larger force, it can turn that force's own offensive geometry into the architecture of its destruction. The question now is not whether Russia will adapt. Russia will adapt. Russia always adapts eventually, and at a cost in human life that no democratic society would accept. The question is whether the adaptation can come fast enough to matter in 2026 before the political ground in Moscow shifts under the weight of accumulating military failures. Because the men who crawled through that pipe and the men who watched them crawl through that pipe are not just casualties of one battle. They are casualties of a theory of war that has now been disproven in public on the western bank of a river the Kremlin never should have crossed. The strategic forecast from here is sobering on every side. Ukraine will press the advantage at Kupiansk and along the Oskil through the winter, attempting to convert operational success into broader pressure on the Russian northern flank. Russia will attempt to recover the narrative through escalation elsewhere, most likely with intensified strikes on Ukrainian energy infrastructure, new pushes around Pokrovsk, and renewed diplomatic pressure aimed at Western publics rather than Western governments. The next 90 days will reveal whether Ukrainian forces can convert the Kupiansk breakthrough into a wider operational reversal across the Eastern Front, or whether the Russian system will absorb the shock, regenerate, and keep grinding. But the verdict on the campaign of 2025 is already in. Russia committed its largest single axis of effort to Kupiansk. Russia lost it. And in losing it, Russia exposed the structural failure at the heart of its entire approach to this war, the belief that a 20th century army, run by a 21st century autocrat, could overwhelm a smaller adversary that had genuinely modernized its way of fighting. That belief is now bleeding out 27-1 on the western bank of the Oskil River. If you want to understand what comes next, stay with this channel, because the questions raised by Kupiansk and Frieski and Dusanchi and Naintri and Kalbrangshi about manpower, about doctrine, about whether modern offensive warfare is even possible anymore against a properly armed, drone-saturated defender, those questions are going to define the next phase of this war, and they do not have simple answers. We will be tracking every milestone, every operational shift, and every strategic consequence as they unfold. If you found this analysis valuable, please subscribe to the channel and help us reach our next subscriber goal. Every subscriber helps this work continue and helps us bring you the kind of strategic clarity that mainstream coverage will not. Hit the bell so you do not miss the next update, because the next update is coming sooner than the Kremlin would like you to believe. The war did not change in a single day at Kupiansk. The war revealed itself at Kupiansk, and what it revealed is that the side built on bad assumptions is now running out of time, out of men, and out of stories to tell. The verdict has been delivered on the western bank of the Oskil. The only question left is how long Moscow can pretend it has not heard it.